I'm Sophie Volpe, Acting Director of the Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 5th Elvira Kwong Siam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. This endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the Center for Chinese Studies by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall semester to present a public lecture, meet with faculty and graduate students, and generally foster scholarly exchange and debate among colleagues. The namesake of this series, Elvira Kwong Siam Lim, was born in Shantou, Guangdong province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. She passed away in Oakland, California on March 27, 2006. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Tina Liu, who is well known to many of us. Tina received her AB from Harvard College in 1990 and her PhD from Harvard University in Comparative Literature in 1998. She's a specialist in Chinese fiction and drama and the author of Person, Roles, and Minds on Ming Qing, and of Accidental Incest, Filial Cannibalism, and Other Peculiar Encounters in Late Imperial Literature. She is the co-editor with Andrew Schoenbaum of a forthcoming work that I think comes to about 600 to 800 pages. Is that something like that? It's an edited volume on Hong Lo Meng, Story of the Stone, a teaching sort of companion, which will be published by the MLA. And her forthcoming book, from which she'll be of which she'll be speaking today, is A Coin, a Decapitated Head, the Non-Pareil Object in Chinese Literature. She's also the author of the article on the literary culture of the late Ming in the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature. Tina and I have known each other, I think, for over 20 years. Is that right? And we saw each other briefly earlier today. And I have to say, after I left, I was driving, and all these moments from 15 years ago, 20 years ago, kept flooding through my head. And I have to admit, probably to Tina's relief, that none of these moments was really dignified enough to share with a larger audience in an event of this solemnity. But what I was left with was a sense of shared teleology that we shared 20 years ago. And I have to say that reading Tina's latest work, as well as her earlier work, that shared sense of mission is still very present, and I think the degree to which our students have benefited from reading her work is a testimony to that. So, without further ado.
Can I move my glass up? Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me and for accommodating some unusual requests. Those of you who will be coming to dinner will know what I mean. I will be talking about Chinese literature, but first, let's go to the hardware store together. Okay. This summer, my husband and I decided to remodel our upstairs bathroom, which is covered now, which was covered in 30-year-old moldy linoleum. So we were looking for some new porcelain tile, and I like this. My husband said, we need to go see it. So it turns out I liked it because it looks like natural stone, which costs many times more than we can afford. Now, why does it look like natural stone? Because a digital photograph of stone has been printed on the surface. So it's a pitted surface printed onto this smooth as glass surface. Now, I want to tell you that when I picked this thing up, I wanted to drop it. I really resented it. I felt about it the way I feel about students who plagiarize. I took it personally, was it that this tile was a kind of porcelain poseur, miserable in its non-stone status? Was it a social climber? Or did my resentment of this tile mask my own self-loathing for my own aspirations for stone flooring on a professor's salary? So I want to consider how late imperial people experienced objects in their own embodied lives. And some of these objects make jokes about their surfaces much more knowingly than this hateful tile. So there's this and this, which are examples that I could choose from hundreds, thousands of others. Now let me begin with Wu Ye's play, Mo Ling Chun. Anyone who's read Liao Zhai or Xiaoping essays knows that objects can turn into persons or can be treated as persons. And in that cultural milieu, here's one person who regards himself as an object. He's ironically surnamed Zhen, or real, and he is Mo Ling Chun's Fu Jing, or supporting clown, and he is astonishingly ugly. His appearance makes other people gawk at him, and that makes him unhappy. So Zhenqi and his servant have a long conversation in which it isn't clear whether he's a human being or a grotesque, cobbled together out of various objets d'art. And what follows, this act, is a long pun in which every term could refer to a description of his body, but is also part of the rich vocabulary having to do with the decorative arts. Words for glazes, shapes, colors, patterns, some of the wide range of decorated surfaces in the mid-17th century world. So he describes himself, and don't you know, and this is a new field for me, so please correct me at the end if you see problems. Don't you know I was born a bloodied exorcistic fetish and grew into a mud-encrusted totem to ward off evil, with a minor bird eye, skin like a yellow eel's stomach, dragon patterning, and a butterfly beast face. Now, how can he improve his circumstances? His manservant Aji proposes a makeover. And comparing his boss's face to an object, Aji says, ladies these days like old jade made up anew. Maybe his boss can do the same thing. Zhen points to his face and says, look at this thing of mine. A field of wax with a mercury blush, pomegranate skin with some speckles of cinnabar, cracks in the skin like sesame seeds, ghost face wrinkles, wrinkles like a crab shell. It's all like smoke fumigating some old paintings, or like the pattern of cracks on old lacquer, like a plum blossom, or a snake's belly, or cowhide, like gilt paper, or wax-marked paper, calligraphic models filled in with ink. Aji then compares his master to an antique whose price would be raised by putting it into a Zitan box and wrapped in brocade cloth. Zhen says, if I wear something chestnut-colored, something else green, I'll look like a living Jiangxi kiln mistake. Crabapple red, melon rind green, people will laugh that I'm a Henan speckled glaze. The act continues, making reference to hundreds of terms having to do with the appearance of various collector's items, and largely with the aesthetic of the grotesque. Mottled surfaces, cracks, patterns that resemble deformed faces. What makes us who we are? How easily can we change who we are? What is the relationship between what others think we are and what we really are? When it comes to identity, theatricality, and the market economy, these are familiar questions, and they've been addressed by many scholars. But Zhenqi asks them through a specific prism, the comparison between himself and an object, specifically an objet. The engagement with actual objects, or more specifically their surfaces, doesn't strike me as coincidental. Now, would this ugly man be changed by the addition of a layer of surface? What would then be his true essence, the face or that cloth? Aji asks the question by comparing his boss to an object. Zhenqi's response suggests that the surface is the essence and that we are our surfaces. These jars pose the same question in glaze and porcelain. Which is the surface here? Jar or cloth? Has jar been changed? Is the painted textile part of the porcelain surface? Also known as chuanqi, two images, Lingchun features surfaces, reflections, mirages, and other eye tricks galore. The relationship between surfaces and solid objects is explicitly thematized. But I hope that in spinning out what an ying is, we can see that some of the biggest issues of the day, among them value, identity, materialism, are inseparable from how we consider something like this. A cup from the late Ming, made of the same hetian, khotan, jade as the cup in the play. It and the play occupied the same imaginative universe. It's possible that a copy of the play and a cup like this one even at some point occupied the same room. A growing number of late imperial literature scholars are interested in the social life of things. The late imperial world was, as writers of the period tell us, full of stuff, a lot of which survives today. But these objects can be thought of, as the art historian Jonathan Hay has argued, as agents, actively shaping how people interacted with them. And in writing about writings about things, we have to be concerned about the things as much as with the writing. Human minds, then and now, do not compartmentalize their experiences neatly. I think about literature at Lowe's and sometimes about Lowe's when I'm reading. What sort of dialogue can we imagine between objects and texts about objects, or more broadly, between different parts of our own lives? Mo Lingchun's story is very convoluted, so please bear with me. In a match arranged by Li Houzhu, the last emperor of the Tang, the young scholar Xu Shi is, as a child, informally betrothed to the girl next door, General Huang Ji's daughter, Huang Zhanyang. Huang Ji's sister was one of Li Houzhu's wives, Bao Yi, and Xu Shi's father was one of Li Houzhu's officials. The Huang family owns a mirror and folios of rubbings that are Bao Yi's legacy. Xu Shi possesses an heirloom jade cup. And in return for the rubbings, Xu Shi trades his house and the jade cup to the Huang family. And he then goes to Luoyang to seek his fortune. Zhanyang fills the cup with wine, and in it she sees the reflection of a handsome young man. Meanwhile, Zhenqi steals her mirror in a fit of pique, but then has it seized from him by the long dead, yes, ghost, Taoist priestess Madame Geng. She then appears on earth as a vendor in a temple fair and gives the mirror to Xu Shi. When he looks into the mirror, he sees a beautiful girl. And then boy and girl fall in love with each other, or rather their images in these respective items. And while she's in love, so obviously she has to go into a coma. And while her body is lying comatose in Nanjing, Zhanyang's spirit travels to the spirit world and to her dead aunt Bao Yi and her aunt's dead husband Li Houzhu. And they basically regard her as their daughter and marry her to Xu Shi, who leads the southern Tang armies in defeating Liu Chang, the king of the southern Han. This battle is fought between two dead generals and two supernatural vanished states. While in the world of the dead, Zhanyang is given a scorched tail pipa. Now, meanwhile, in the world of the living, a summons from the palace arrives, and Zhanyang's maidservant, Niao Yan, takes her place and goes into the palace. She is carrying with her the jade cup. Zhanyang plays the pipa for her groom, and it happens that the scorched tail pipa is now vanished from the Song Emperor's coffers, and so Zhanyang is overheard by musician Cao, who recognizes that this is the scorched tail pipa and attempts to arrest them. Zhanyang vanishes. She's a ghost. And Xu Shi is basically detained and brought into the capital. Fortunately, the official in charge of the questioning is his friend, Cai Keqing, and asks him, instead of going through an interrogation, to write a piece of a prose about the pipa. The piece of prose is brilliant, of course, and he's promoted to be Zhuangyuan in an extremely unusual exam. Meanwhile, Niao Yan, who is regarded officially as Huang Zhanyang, is married to Xu Shi. They identify each other by means of the jade cup. And then they return to Nanjing, where all is explained. And there is, at the end, a happy trio of lovers, a husband, a wife, a secondary wife, and all the things are now shared out among them. Now, this play contains 4 signature objects: an heirloom jade cup that at the play's beginning belongs to Xu Shi, a precious mirror that belonged to Bao Yi and is now the property of the Huangs, a scorched tail pipa, and finally the rubbings belonging to the Huang family. It's impossible to pin down the ownership of any of these items. They switch hands through inheritance, magic, imperial bequests, and marriage. Now, when a dynasty ends, does court ownership revert to private ownership? What happens to ownership in general among other social relations when a dynasty collapses? The Ming Qing transition and the questions that it posed about legitimacy and continuity are very much the backdrop of this play. Wu Weiye was, of course, also the best-known lyric chronicler of the dynastic fall. But these are not problems that are limited to dynastic falls, and the greater problem of ownership and its transfer is at the heart of late imperial fiction and drama. And this is the constellation of issues that I'm working on now. What can be bought? What cannot? What can be owned, and by whom? Are some forms of possession more legitimate than others? What makes some forms of possession more legitimate, more permanent, more valorized? Virtually every chuanqi play concerns these problems, and usually these plays work by juxtaposing different claims. So the same object might be inherited by one person, bought by another, or an object might be created by an artist, then sold to another, or a connoisseur might want something that a powerful official has acquired. And you can summarize all these plots as which set of hands has a higher claim to this thing. Sometimes there's the fantasy of an ownership that is established by the object itself. And Ming Qing literature is filled with objects that come alive in some way or other. And I think we can read these in the context of these wrestlings with ownership. So after being loved into personhood, an object might confer on its owner rights over itself, the ne plus ultra of legitimate ownership. And such an object cannot be given away. This particular object fantasy obviously has something to do with subalterity in general, where in this case, voice has been given to the voiceless, and it turns out that what it wants is to stay with its master. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to come up with a taxonomy of all the verbs used to describe the interaction between a person and his things. I, wan, no, among many, many others. We have to come up with some different word than fondle to translate all of these. How is what each of these implies different? And the ecology of these multiple terms collectively reflects what is common wisdom at the time, that possession is not binary. It's not that you own it or you don't. It consists of gray shades of legitimacy and attachment, that some kinds of ownership trump other kinds, that some objects can be transferred, but with others, the connection between human and thing is much more profound and cannot be severed. In Mo Ling Chun, for example, one word for the external expression of how a person treats a possession, ai wan, translates into English the same way as ma sa or mo suo, to fondle, to caress. But while the former binome is always something positive in the play, the second binome is always something negative. It's always something that is an illegitimate kind of interaction between a person and a thing. Now, what all 4 of the play's signature objects share is a play on Ying versus Xing. All are 3-dimensional objects that become surfaces for projection, or in the case of the pipa, dimensionless sound. Zhanyang sees a reflection of Xu Shi in the wine of the jade cup. Xu Shi sees her image in the mirror. The rubbings transfer an image from a solid thing into a two-dimensional thing. Now, what's foregrounded is this contrast between the solidity of the item and the non-solidity of the image. And the 17th century writer Li Yu says this about jade wine cups, that jade brings out wine's color. So it's a kind of picture frame. And like many texts of the period, Mo Lingchun is deeply concerned with the relationship between the frame and the work of art inside. Now, one obvious focus of this concern in the 17th century was the theater, and late imperial people seem to have been compelled to try to understand the relationship between the onstage world and the offstage world. Sophie's written a book about this. And one reading of the theater was basically as a kind of separate, smaller world. And images of the puppet theater, I think, obviously suggest this metaphor. But it isn't just explicit depictions of the stage that refer to an alternate miniaturized existence. Other late imperial artists, too, found the idea of miniaturized worlds irresistible. Here's a famous objet that all of you have probably seen before. And I think that for the 18th century viewer, this kind of object with its hidden depth suggests some of the pleasures of the theater. You'll note that it's difficult to see all the way in. It's contained and finite, but with depths. Or consider this miniaturized entrance. This is also a very small object. Its door inviting your gaze, but never quite admitting you. Even more than the olive pit, the door suggests the presence of further levels to which you are not granted access. Mo Lingchun's version of the theater isn't a small world, but a flat screen. And when Jianyan's body wastes away, her worried father hires a local Taoist practitioner. Mr. Feng practices yuanguang reading, a kind of divination, and he enlists a virgin boy, Aji from next door, and Mr. Feng glues paper onto a wall, walks a special magical pattern, and recites a chant. And then Aji says, there's light, a round circle, just like the moon. It's a light, but we would call it a screen. At first, a young girl appears in Aji's vision, then an older woman, and he describes their setting, which is ostensibly a great imperial palace, but is functionally a stage. Now, a great house is presenting itself, all of its columns golden embellished. Around each column winds a 5-clawed golden dragon. Looks a little like that, I think, or this. The boy goes on to describe an emperor and an empress in the center of this image, attended by palace girls and eunuchs. An older woman leads the girl to the front to pay obeisance to the emperor, and then he leads an army out. They meet up with a young scholar. A great battle follows, at the end of which the emperor is victorious. And Aji pauses. Mr. Feng burns another charm, and he looks again. And this time he sees an arena filled with people, the emperor, the empress, officials, priests, priestesses, all arrayed in 2 rows, and then in the front, a number of women playing wind and string instruments and dancing. It's a vision on a piece of paper, but it also seems like a miniaturized entertainment. I think it resembles closely a puppet show, maybe, or a 杂剧. The girl presented to the emperor meeting the young scholar, the defeat of the enemy, the wedding at the end. This isn't a good play. Okay, this little mini play is a terrible play. It's probably the most banal thing you could imagine in the 1650s, but it is watched on a flat surface, and onto that is projected an image with dimension. Here is a vase with a scene from Wudanting on it, and this is something like the play's jade cup or mirror, a solid object with an image on it, where a person gets to experience the pleasure of considering a 2-dimensional experience and a 3-dimensional object at the same time. And I think that this is not simply an illustration, but it's a kind of fantasy version of play watching, suggesting the private watching that is so often fetishized in plays themselves. These plays are filled with scenes of voyeurism. And in the 17th century, private viewing of plays was a privilege of the rich and the cultural elite. And so it kind of makes sense that one fantasy would be an ultimate privacy. Now, the second time Zhanyang sees the young man, he is no longer localized to a reflection within a cup, but instead appears on something like a screen. It is clearly, this is something she's saying, it's clearly my family's folio of Jin and Tang writings. How is it that I can't touch it? Let me trim the wick and look at it. That's strange. I can't trim the wick. It's as if there is a thin layer of gauze or a light curtain before me, so that everything is bright and clear, but all of it covered from me. And here's the sweet smoke of the incense, blowing up to me, turning into a thick fog and a quiet cloud, enveloping my sleeves, but none of it penetrating. Now what she sees is something like this, the gauze. What she sees is something like this Wanli era illustration of pipa, with the room's curtains marking off depth, just as Zhanyang's imaginary thin gauze does. Depictions of the scholarly space, like the boudoir, are set deep within with markers to indicate depth. So these are just kind of standard representations. And they're all suggestions. Li Ling Xiao has recounted how common it is for illustrations from this period to have valences or curtains on them as suggestions for the embedded space of the stage. I think that these textiles might not gesture so much specifically at the stage as at depth and interiors themselves. And I think that it's quite likely that woodblock illustrators were sometimes envisioning something like this, but unable to depict it in woodblock. More often, though, different layers of depth have all been telescoped into a single flat surface. This is an illustration of a scene in the novel Jinping Mei. Although the interior depicts depth, the pleasure lies precisely in considering all of these patterns as pure visual surface: carpet, painting, clothing, balustrade, book jackets. This pleasure, this kind of visual pleasure, is the visual equivalent of the linguistic texture of the chuanqi drama, which is all about surfaces of language. Arias are peppered with allusions. On one level, they say something quite literal, but the classical reference makes the punning obviously something else. And you can consider Zhenqi's punning self-description in exactly this way, where you can think of the pun as a way to draw attention to two competing surfaces. Here's a plate with a scene from Xishanji, and in this plate, at least 3 fields of depth have all been turned into pure surface. And it resembles what Xu Shi is magically able to see in the mirror. He concludes that the girl he sees in the mirror has to be an official's daughter. He says, "You must live in a secluded compound, and then I wouldn't dare to look at you full on anyway." I've translated Shenjai Dayuan as a secluded compound, but I think that the notion of depth in Shen is actually central. In the screen, the reflective surface of the mirror allows what is deep down to be brought up to the surface. And plays work a magic like this mirror. They cheat depth. They replace them instead with a single surface that penetrates across walls and through curtains. And those of you who know Chinese plays know how many scenes in Chinese plays treat characters where one is on one side of the wall and another set of characters is on the other side of the wall. In Coins, Bodies, Games, and Gold, Leslie Kirk, who teaches in the classics department here, sees different genres in classical Greek literature as presenting different sides of a cultural battle. On one side, there's a patrician disdain for commerce. On the other side, a populist critique of inherited status. Observers from the 16th century on have seen late imperial culture in very similar terms. And one very major cultural battleground concerned things. Craig Clunas has analyzed writings about connoisseurship, and he sees elites engaged in this constant struggle to define themselves and their tastes in contradistinction to possessors of newer wealth. Jonathan Hay writes of the rise in the late Ming of an aesthetic that he calls urban spectacle that is counterbalanced by literati taste, which is marked by restraint and understatement. Now, elsewhere, I've been thinking about how people of the period considered the transfer of value, most particularly through the prism of the fourth story in the Zhao Shibei collection, in which night soil dealing is compared to gambling. You guys have been spared my poo-poo lecture, in other words. There and elsewhere in the corpus of Huabin fiction, value seems to be something that is almost liquid. One item converts to the next. Specific objects lack traction. And scenes of gambling in vernacular fiction are quite common, and the genre as a whole is deeply concerned with chance and the possibility of randomness. I think that one can, crudely, conceive of two poles in the period, where on one hand, a short story can treat the human feces that are the source of wealth and the miser of new pits becomes a millionaire. Everything eventually turns into shit, literally. And on the other hand, a play can dwell on a reflection on the surface of wine poured into an heirloom jade cup. It's the ultimate in fetishized objects for which there is no substitution, no obvious value. So it seems that we're veering between fears of an all-consuming materialism and an aestheticized sentimentality. Now, where do chuanqi belong in such a schema? In chuanqi, as those of you who read chuanqi or watch chuanqi know, status-based disagreements are turned into plots. In this play, it happens focused around these images. So some characters see a reflection, others see only the solid jade cup. Characters in the play repeatedly rank goods according to how much they prize them. So humbler characters assign priority to real estate. Elite characters favor unreal estate, and the unrealer, the better. So when the play opens, our hero wants to examine calligraphy. His slightly less refined friend is more interested in bronzes and jades. And Shi says, oh, those hard goods are easy to judge. They don't take much of an eye. The first mention of jade as a category is as yinhuo, referring to jade's hardness, but the bino more commonly refers to bullion or valuable. So jade, even the number one jade objet, as Tai refers to the heirloom cup, has a kind of liquidity to it, which is disturbing as compared to calligraphy and painting. Now, eventually, Shi demonstrates fully his ranking of objects. He throws in his own house after he trades the jade cup for folios of rubbings. And then above all of these, he comes to treasure an image in a mirror. Obviously, his manservant is appalled. Now, let's stop a moment and consider the obvious social dimension to this problem of surface. Can one tell a person's status from his or her surface? Is there correspondence between the inside and the outside? The play equates the theme of surfaces with the social problem of appearances. And it happens that the elite think that looking elite is equivalent to being elite, and the poor think that looking elite is a matter of appearances and is ultimately smoke and mirrors. When Shi needs to prove that he did not steal the pipa from the imperial coffers, Cai Kexing assigns him an essay. And everyone around him is abuzz and says, what kind of a logic is this? Could it be that a thief, with all this evidence against him, should produce a single piece of writing and then be spared a guilty verdict? Tai suggests that Shi is innocent, because how could someone who looks as he does be guilty? Tai's logic is precisely the same as Shi's when he falls in love with the reflection in the mirror and says that it has to be an official's daughter. If you look into a jade cup and you see a surface image as compelling as its outside, more compelling than its outside, then you also believe in the examination system, in place of the judicial system, and in essentialized social distinction. Looking at an object and turning a disagreement about it into disagreements about what makes for social status is not something I'm imposing. It's at the heart of Mo Lingchen. Now, in chuanqi, society is fragmented and then reassembled at the end of the play. Here, that resolution takes place not through a change in the object's surfaces, but by an agreement that what is important about them has changed. What was magic in the play's beginning is consensus by fiat at the end. And each of the play's surfaces, this is at the very end of the play, the characters talk about the transformation that these objects have experienced. So Niao Yan offers up the jade cup now as a nuptial goblet. Xu Shi calls the precious mirror a marital mirror. The folios now, he says, document the formal exchange of information that seals the match between bride and groom. Now, is the jade cup, formerly heirloom, then part of a trade, finally a token of identity, changed in and of itself when Niao Yan calls it a betrothal gift and now their nuptial cup? I think that this is a kind of joke that late imperial people, or at least late imperial people who had the good fortune to surround themselves with luxury items, were well schooled in. And I would argue that we're meant to see these items at the end as something like this, another decorative object whose existence is somehow layered. What is startling is precisely the contrast between a surface that's familiar and something beneath it that is not. I love this one. Another way in which two sides of an argument about surfaces and solids align was a subject of obviously great significance in 1653. And this play goes out of its way to violate what we might call a materialist logic, which is that this play goes against the idea that each character and each object should be accounted for and singular at any particular time. Now, how and when is the pipa removed from the Song imperial coffers? It only makes sense that the instrument disappears if the Song imperial coffers are exactly the same as Li Houzhu's own treasure room, as if Li Houzhu and the first Song emperor existed simultaneously, each of them in possession of the same singular pipa. This denies the historical reality, which is, of course, that Li Yu was poisoned by Zhao Guanyin and that their possession of the same treasures was sequential. Li Houzhu can seize the pipa so that it vanishes from the present without explanation. And we cannot account for this. So at any given moment, we can't tell whether he is one pipa, two pipas, or no pipas. Is the historical past ongoing? Timelines circle back and do not quite work out. Objects move around unaccountably. Wu Weiye was one of the most famous of the early Qing archon, those men who served under both Ming and Qing. He became a jingshi in his early 20s in 1631. He took office under the Chongzhen Emperor and then again in the southern Ming court. Sometime in 1652, he was invited to serve under the first Qing Emperor Shunzhi. And he left all posts in all three regimes under a cloud. And by his old age, he had famously repudiated his service in the Qing. Mo Lingchen was written right before he took office at the Qing Imperial Academy, presumably at a period of time when he was deciding whether or not he should serve. Now, the play is set in the first years of Song Taizu's reign, but the play makes almost no mention of the present dynasty. And where in most plays the arithmetic of historical reign dates and of time's passage is usually quite straightforward, here there's a chronology that is impossible to work out. Xu Shi fights against Liu Chang and not Li Houzhu's real enemy, Song Taizu, because the outcome of battles between the southern Tang and the southern Han was historically inconsequential. Both of these states were swallowed up by the Song almost effortlessly. So in Act 30, for the last time, we see the ghost of Liu Chang, and he's been defeated by Xu Shi. He's still plotting revenge against Li Houzhu. In the netherworld, Battles go on all the time, defeats and triumphs equally inconsequential. The dead killed again and again, only to fight again and again against the same enemy, no outcome permanent. It's kind of like this. The pattern here is sometimes invisible, apparent only in the light. The pattern is hidden. It's an anhua. Is the surface here porcelain, or is the surface here the flower pattern? It's both. As long as the bowl exists, both patterns will continue on, just as the past does, an invisible, ubiquitous, simultaneous undercurrent to the present. To be an archon, if you believe this particular version of history, if you believe simultaneously in the porcelain and in the flower pattern underneath, in conflicts that have no end, have essentially no stakes, but have been reduced to pattern, is no act of immorality. Surely this pattern, this notion of historicity, appreciating time's passage as repeating aestheticized patterns emptied of content, is one pre-modern Chinese version of moral relativism. Okay, so which is it? Was Wu Weiye a loyalist? Did he, as he writes of in poetry, long for the Ming? Or did he, with only some minor hesitation, serve two dynasties when it looked as if he might have a good chance at having a successful official career? This isn't a knot that can be perfectly untied. History is reduced to pattern, but the pattern has the energy to keep unspooling precisely because of its moral weight. This is a picture not of resolution, but of internal conflict. Ultimately, Leslie Kirk's framework doesn't work precisely because, in the late imperial case, the relationship between two competing mentalities doesn't map into separate transactional orders, to use her terms. Where Kirk sees fairly externalized conflicts, where whole genres are associated with competing interests. For the long Chinese 17th century, these conflicts are really to be found inside interests, within social classes, and perhaps most importantly, within individuals. This isn't a new observation. The scholar Yun Shi uses this anecdote to categorize the Shishang, his name for the hybrid elite that arose in the Ming. And this is from Zhou Hui's Jingling Suo Shi, which relates a conversation in which Wang Shizhen remarks that Huizhou merchants crawled towards Suzhou literati like flies on stinky mutton. Wang Shizhen was incidentally native to the same town as Wu Weiye. Their families intermarried for generations. Zhan Dongtu, a native of Huizhou, answered, Suzhou literati also swarm to Huizhou merchants just as flies buzz around stinky meat. Wang Shizhen replied with a smile. To Yun Shi, this exchange demonstrates the interdependence of Wenren and Guren and of Suzhou and Xinan. But how are we to understand Wang Shizhen's wordless laugh? Sorry. 笑而不答. I'm missing a character there. I must have cut and pasted and lost it. Read the da at the very end. His agreement is silent precisely because no late imperial literatus could have actually said these words. You're right. Those pursuits that others, Shi and I feel, characterize us as a group they're actually supported by merchants' money. Nobody could say that. His agreement is unvoiced because the actual mechanics of mercantile activity are carefully elided from documents of all kinds, but maybe especially when it comes to literati culture. When we, as historians of Chinese literature, try to understand and answer important questions like, how much money did Xu Wei make off of his paintings? Did he actually make a living through his paintings or through his plays? The sources say nothing. They never will say anything. Wang Shizhen's silence is the silence of his age. And to be a good reader of text from this age involves reading loud silences. Let me conclude by looking at an object and a silence that invite a different kind of engagement. The signature object in Kong Shangren's play Xiao Hulei, another pipa. Probably like many of you, I found myself moved by the surprise ending to Judith Zeitlin's essay on Xiao Hulei in the HJS, where she reveals that she's seen the real thing, Kong Shangren's actual pipa, now in the archives of the Palace Museum in Beijing. Zeitling's essay treats the pipa's biography, an antique supposedly dating from the 9th century, purchased by the playwright Kong Shangren in 1691, and the subject of a play for which he wrote the prose portion in 1694. I'll try to tell this story very quickly too. Again, kind of confusing. It's mostly based on an anecdote in the 9th century 乐府杂录. A young scholar, Liang Hoben, buys the pipa from an antique dealer, but it's seized by a eunuch who claims that it properly belongs in the palace. There it's played by Zheng Yingying, who had been betrothed in early childhood to Liang Hoben, but is now a palace entertainer, having been sent there by her conniving evil brother. When she's ordered to go before the emperor, Zheng Yingying refuses. She tosses the instrument onto the ground so that it has to be repaired. It's coincidentally sent to the same antique dealer from whom Liang had purchased it. Later, when her brother rebels, she's ordered to be strangled, and her friends in the palace carefully place her dead body into a casket and set it afloat onto a river where she's found by Liang Hoben. The girl revives, the two young people identify each other, and they kind of have this love nest, but she wants her pipa back. And so Liang goes back to the antique dealer, who gives him the pipa, ostensibly since he never returned Liang's purchase price of 50 taels of silver. Later, when Zheng Yingying plays her instrument, she's overheard by a eunuch who recognizes both musician and instrument. Bride and groom are brought into the emperor, but the emperor forgives them both and bequeaths the pipa to Zheng Yingying. Zeitling characterizes this plot as a struggle for ownership. I see this as something more profound, not simply a struggle for this object among a handful of characters, but one that interrogates ownership itself. The pipa over which they fight is several things at once: an object for sale for 50 taels of silver, a court object to be granted by the emperor, a thing of wood, exquisite and tiny, Zeitlin says, the size of a ukulele, that can be seized from one person. I think by this point, you all are familiar with the kind of object that is many things at once. Only at the very end of the play, when the emperor has granted the xiaohulei to the musician and her husband, who also had happened to buy the instrument much earlier, and who also now possesses the instrument at the moment, are all these different versions of ownership, coterminous. Now, we first see the pipa in Act 6, but first the antique dealer introduces himself and his other wares. He says, fragmented stone inscriptions, I mount them and call them hand seal script or Qin calligraphy. A broken down black loach of an instrument, if it's old, I'll attribute it to Kongrong or to Jikang. Acts of deception, cheating the world at prices, getting a few hundred or a few thousand, it's all a laugh at them. So this is a pipa that lacks any provenance. It's in the shop of a known forger. It could not possibly be authentic. But wait, isn't this Kong Shangren's own pipa a signature object owned by the playwright himself? His feelings for it are manifestly grounded in materiality. After buying it, he had 2 of its pegs engraved with poetry he wrote and the imprint of his own seal. One would think that such a play would valorize the legitimacy of ownership. And instead, the only kind of connection given any priority in the play is Yingying's. The instrument and the girl are so closely associated, it's hard to separate their identities. Just like the pipa, the girl was given first to Liang Hoben, then to the emperor. She's damaged, then secretly resurrected, and finally given full imperial recognition. Concluding his poem, Bogu Xianqing, Kong Shangren has an anecdote about the xiaohulei as an instrument in the present day. Fan Huapo was so good at playing the pipa it seemed magical. He happened to be shown the xiaohulei, and when he picked it up and strummed it, it was as if he was encountering his own possession. His own compositions he picked out on the broken-down instrument. The sound stirred up everyone's melancholy. What a shame that there was no Yingying who could experience it. Gu Wu here must mean Fan Huapo's own original possession, as opposed to the actually more common meaning of an old object passed down. Or perhaps it means something he's known before, kind of the equivalent in thingness of a guren or an old friend. No number of hand-carved pegs can give the antiquarian a higher claim on the instrument than the virtuoso who's never seen it before. But even he cannot get out of this shell of an instrument anything but a shadow of music. So what is the real xiaohulei? Who truly possesses it? Xiaohulei turns out to be just as much its sound, evanescent, intangible, incapable of being possessed, and vanished, as it is the object in the National Palace Museum, ostensibly almost 1,000 years old at the time of Kongshanren's purchase. Its ownership there is sure. I certainly wouldn't try to steal something from the museum, but it's unpossessed and will end its days in that state, a sad, unfulfilled, lonely end to the life of a musical instrument. That's one ending. But it still leaves us a gnarly problem: how we are to deal with the mutually exclusive truths of the play's cool distance to ownership and materiality and the collector's own talismanic treatment of the pipa. We somehow have to find some interpretive space to assimilate both. Is it simply genre that makes the thoughts I think when I'm standing at Lowe's looking at tiles different from those that come to me when I'm delivering a paper at Cal? Am I one self or many? Kongshanren is many Kongshanrens: the collector, the author of the play's prose dialogue, the commentator on his own poem. These different selves are at cross purposes, and there is no single Kongshanren who will, with self-understanding, account for all of them, but instead obdurately separate and competing voices. This is another kind of silence, as evocative as Wang Shizhen's. We see what pre-moderns either did not or could not, that Kongshanren is ensnared. He is at once canny playwright and avid collector, commissioning costly, precious ivory pegs for his hard-won acquisition, which is revealed to be a forgery in the play. The play focuses on the object's social content, emptying out its materiality totally, while the life of Kongshanren's prize pipa fetishizes its materiality. The playwright confesses in other characters' voices doubts about materiality and ownership. The collector stamps his seal on the pipa. So on one hand, labor and power relations. On the other, the object as fetish. I'm reminded of Karl Marx in this vacillation between material and immaterial. Marx writes in his description of commodity fetishism that objects are turned into independent beings endowed with life when people cannot see them for what they actually are, the product of human labor. In Knowledge and Human Interests, the social theorist Jürgen Habermas categorizes different kinds of knowledge. So what is our task as sinologists? How do we know? What are we looking for? Obviously, ours is not one of the empirical, analytical sciences, but what Habermas would call an act of cultural hermeneutics. Wang Shizhen and Kongshanren both gesture towards a gap, either the true relationship between shi and shang, or what fetishizing an object is really about. It is not simply that they do not speak about these matters, but that they cannot speak of them. The late imperial record is filled with gaps just like these, some having to do with precisely the issues that we moderns find most intriguing: gender relations, sexuality, power, the place of money. And it is our place to understand how these gaps and these silences inform and warp everything around them. We cannot take the past only on its terms. To Habermas, that makes all of us in this business post-Freudians, whether we acknowledge it or not. Freud's interpretive power underlies hermeneutics as a whole, and specifically our brand of cultural hermeneutics. In Interpretation of Dreams, Freud isn't really writing about dreams, but about what happens to knowledge in the face of actual repression, what he calls the permanent internal compulsion that creates distorted and self-limiting communication. All cultures operate through permanent internal compulsion, but perhaps late imperial China deserves a gold medal with its famously skeletal state, but its powerful state-focused orthodoxy. Their orthodoxy is not ours. We ought to feel discomfort with it. When I teach classical Chinese, I always repeat a bit of wisdom passed down to me from Stephen Owen, that what makes classical Chinese readable is that so few things are said in it. He always used to say, Tina, it's just the same thing over and over. The flip side is that there are so many things that cannot be said. Now, if we think of repression as something external and institutional, if we're interested in collective expression and not individual biography, then the structural equivalent of the dreams that emerge from the repressed ego is the whole range of literary and cultural output from the late imperial period. This is Habermas again. Freud understands cultural tradition as the collective unconscious, censored in varying measure and turned outwards, where motives that have been split off from communication are driven incessantly about and are directed by the excluded symbols into channels of substitute gratification. Motives that have been split off from communication, shunted off into channels of substitute gratification. That is to a T the whole range of imaginative literature in the late imperial period. Chuanqi might be the dream version of elite reality, with their focus precisely on what could not ever take place: romance, justice according to aesthetic standards, signature objects that wage war against homogenizing materialism, a world where every action has an otherworldly significance, where the social messiness of capitalism has been turned into the purity of karmic payback. These are not simply wish fulfillment, but channels of substitute gratification. And perhaps it is not entirely coincidental that Chuanqi staked out the territory of dreams, Freud's own realm of diverted communication. The only way to fully resolve the paradox of the playwright, who is also the collector, lies with us. In this kind of literary analysis, I am analyst, not to treat the text or the writer, not assuming that I know more or that my insights trump theirs, but instead in full recognition of the limits of positivism in telling us what we really want to know. The text cannot tell us everything, and the real answers do not lie just with what we can prove. The answers of interest lie with what they could not say and what they could not know, and with who we are and what we seek. And what is it that we really want to know? Nietzsche says that it is our needs that interpret the world, our instincts and their pro and con. My own need in this project of cultural hermeneutics is to know these people in late imperial China as fully as I can, experientially, as other human beings. Where knowledge in the sciences accumulates gradually, hermeneutical knowledge, writes Habermas, moves at the transcendental level of communication. We are always in conversation with our texts, our interests shaped by our own world, but with the goal that understanding them changes us, our perceptions, and our own world as well. Thank you very much.
Tina, thank you so much. Our discussant will be Robert Ashmore from the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures.
Well, first of all, thanks, Tina. A really great paper. My one complaint is that I received a paper. We always say draft, not for citation, but work in progress. But when I say work in progress, I don't usually mean it as much as Tina, because the current ending actually is I can leave out a bunch of my comments, so these will be shorter than they would have been. So, talk about commodity fetish. What I think I might do is just to open up conversation quickly, and I'll monitor my time. It's a delicate role, because if you don't have anything to say, then it's kind of a bummer, and if you say too much, then everyone gets very antsy. So I'm going to just take about 10 minutes and talk about some general ideas about ways of thinking about things in the world. There are a lot of local moments in the paper that I think are really brilliant and enjoyable. And in general, what I enjoy is the way in which the theoretical level of inquiry is actually carried out in the form of a dialogue with the sources. And so to try to articulate a little bit what I mean by this, I thought it might be useful just kind of stepping back and thinking about the ways that we just consider it as early 21st century humanists tend to think about objects in the world. And I think one of the things, there are various versions of ways of telling the story, but we go through some kind of a story of something like a phenomenological critique of Cartesian thingness that goes something like this. That is, if we think about the being of the thing as the thing in relation to itself, it can seem quite natural to think of the thing as an aggregate of material substance that's locatable in space and that we can track through time, and that when that ability to track it as material through space and time dissolves, then our sense of the thing as having its own being also dissolves. And it's quite natural within the frame of thinking of the thing in itself that we consider this to be the fundamental. This is the ground level of the thingness of the thing. And so the phenomenological critique goes, again, this is a version, hopefully a quick version of something we can do in a lot of ways, is to say that rather, if we think about primordiality not in terms of the thing in itself, but in terms of the way we actually have experience of things, then what we realize is that we in fact never encounter Cartesian things, almost by definition. And that in that sense, in the sense that empirical means based in experience, the more empirical notion of thingness is one that sees the thing as, and this is the kind of phraseology that's always coming up when we talk in this vein, we always saying always already. Things are always already. The thing is always already coming to our attention within a very dense web of our own concerns, our own projections, our own intentions, our own aims, along with the textures of the ways in which other, the social reality and social, conceptual fields impinge on the thing. Just in that first moment of again, in the sense of, this is another way of thinking of primordiality. And I want to use this, again, we can think about also that we imagine that often the coming to awareness, this is to continue that kind of critique part, that often, in fact, the closest thing at the beginning of this coming to attention of the thing, the way in which something like the Cartesian thing comes into being, the thing by itself, is when there's a problem, right? If it's a tooth, we're not aware of having third molars, on the left side until something's going wrong with it. When we're writing, we're not aware of the pen until the pen runs out of ink. So I mentioned this again, just rehashing something that we all sort of go through in a certain way, to think about the space of how we think about these issues. And I think that we don't necessarily have to buy into the notion that the critique gives us the correct answer. I think it's really a matter of choice of perspective. But again, what I like about Tina's approach to these issues in this paper is that it's not a matter of applying a kind of perspective that we get from our formation as graduate students and readers and so forth, and going out and applying it and decoding what the object of study is saying, but there's a kind of sense of dialogue. And so what I thought I would do is I wanted to kind of talk along my sort of train of thought in reading through the paper, and particularly in reference to the Jade Cup, which serves as a very nice focal point in the talk. That is, in a sense, the paper is coming out of the imaginative space of the wonder that, in a sense, as a material object, this thing is continuously has an existence that somehow it's both a potential bridge, but also is interesting because of the way it fails to bridge something. And this is the way that, again, the phenomenological move is a way that opens up our imagination of the things in terms of their historicity that is both a historicity of experience and of social experience. So what comes to my mind as someone who works mostly in earlier periods is, and again, apologies for those of you who know this is one of my favorite. I use this text to think about a lot of stuff. That's in Analects 625. It's a wonderful short utterance by Confucius, and he says, "Gu bu gu, gu zai, gu zai." And I say it in Chinese first because it's very hard to translate, and all the translation problems are very interesting and important, and I think theoretically illuminating for other ways of getting at. I think, in other words, that the culture of what's called Ming Wu, the scholarship of Ming Wu, of things and their names, which is really one of the main categories at work here in the conceptual world of, at least of the scholarly tradition that we're looking at. This is really a foundational moment. And so the passage then is translated, again, inadequately. We say a gu is a ritual vessel. It's a bronze cup that's used to hold wine in sacrificial ritual. It's something like it's kind of a slightly conical shaped beaker. And so what Confucius is saying that the gu, it says the translation is often a gu that is not a proper gu, the gu. And the last two instances of the word gu are simply exclamations. So now the first problem is that the way that I'm teaching classical Chinese this semester, so I have it in my head. The difference between the negative fei and the negative bu. The negative fei negates predication. But that's not what we have here. What's being negated is it's failing to do something. The gu is failing to do something. And of course, we know this relationally. This is standard Confucianism 101, that in the ideal Confucian society, all of the things that are named what they are live up to their names by doing the things, they do the verbal versions of their names. And this is a vision of the harmony, total harmony, where the thing, just as the tool vanishes in its use in the process of the normal course of use, so in the ritual vision of a projected ideal ritual vision of the past, we have this notion that things and the things that correspond to them, especially ritual things, sort of meld together in a seamless, harmonious whole where everything, social action kind of merges into sort of ritual action. And indeed, in later tradition, there's stories about how Confucius says, in the old days, when princes met together, they didn't have to use words. They simply expressed their meanings through ritual. So there's a problem here when Confucius is saying that this particular beaker, this gu, is not guing, it's not doing the gu thing. And then he exclaims, the gu. So I can, as some of you might know, I can go on at length on this, and I want to keep it short. But I think there are a number of hypotheses. That is how we understand the first part. That is Confucius observing a defective gu? That is, there's lots of speculation, commentary. The size is wrong, the shape is wrong, the material is wrong. That's a possibility. He can be saying this gu does not gu because it does not meet the specifications for the thing this thing is supposed to be. But I think another possibility is that whether or not he's in the presence of an object that's prompting the utterance, and whether or not there's a problem with the contemporary manufacture of things that are called gu, that the failure to gu of the gu is still understandable. That is, even a materially correct bronze beaker would fail to do what it's supposed to do if the surrounding sort of complex of social practice is defective. That is, the proper functioning, the proper guing of the gu is dependent. And this is why, again, this is a classic kind of moment in Confucius where he sort of complains about a seemingly trivial thing. And the point is that, well, if this kind of thing is out of whack, then it's indexical. It's symptomatic of the out of whackness of lots of things. So, and then the final exclamation, I think, is also quite interesting. So what is, to whom or what are the final exclamations, gu, repetitions of the word. We can see these as being simply size over the failure of the gu to be designed properly, the falling away from some kind of principle. We can also see them as being addressed to someone else. There are people who don't, if everyone knew what gus really were and what they're supposed to do, there wouldn't be a problem. Therefore, this becomes an address that's enigmatically addressed to only those hearers who know the problem. Or we can take it as addressed as vocative, as addressed to the gu itself. And what's interesting when we think about this is, in fact, the gu becomes a not distant cousin to other sorts of signs like the unicorn. That is, the gu and the breakdown of Confucius's language in simply repeating the syllable, we see that the confrontation with the gu causes Confucius's own language to break down. So that we see this notion of the material object as a site where something comes out of circulation, comes out of its proper function, and becomes this immensely pathos-laden sign of both some kind of dysfunction in the world and of the inability of this prime cultural forebear to articulate himself. So in the case of the unicorn appears. The unicorn is supposed to presage the arrival of the Sage King. The unicorn appears in Confucius' lifetime and is captured and killed. And Confucius is the only one who knows how to read it. but he reads it paradoxically, tragically, in a skewed way. You read the sign of the Sage King, and in the same moment you understand that it's out of its time. And rather than being the real sign of a Sage King, it becomes an alter ego of Confucius, because he's in the same predicament. So I think this is sort of one of the things I think would be interesting to think about with these issues about the unspoken and the culture of the gudong, of the ancient artifact, is that I think there really is there's something here about the naturalness that these really become sites where silence reigns. That is, it's a point of breakdown of language in a certain way. So I want to think about then. So we have this kind of, just using this passage from the Analects as an indication of this earlier things that in the scholarly tradition about how objects that come to us as fragments of something, how they become made objects they become meaning bearing in new ways, but in ways that in some ways are multiplied. That is, it's no longer invisible in ritual function. It has now become something that is, for the right observer, it becomes emblematic of something that is of very vast significance and also personal significance. So we could imagine then, so the question then, if we imagine what if sometime later, in later eras, there's a real gu, of the kind that Confucius was lamenting the absence of. What do we imagine a real gu? How would you know, how do you verify the sort of Cartesian self-identity of the object in this kind of context? And I think one of the answers is that you can only do it in narrative. The only way you verify is you have to have a story in which something weird happens. So we have this from the Tang Dynasty and before, we have this type of story in which the ancient object encrusts itself with verification narratives. I mean, the Gujingji, this early Tang Dynasty Biji's tale that we had a presentation on a couple weeks ago, is a classic example where the story, such as it is a story of a mirror that simply seemingly has the agency of going to possessors in a serial fashion, and then the Gujingji is simply, it becomes the needle that threads together a whole series of narratives and that only share in common that they indicate some kind of a miraculous sign that of the mysterious powers of the mirror. So I think we could imagine a zhenguji very much along these lines. That there would have to be some moment of the recognition. And again, this relates directly to the traditions that Wu Weiya is drawing on around, for example, the musical instrument, the burnt-tailed pipa, which is of course the descendant of Cai Yong's Jiao Wei Qin, where again the relation between the person, the master player, and the zither, the burning of the wood, comes from the story in which he hears the sound of the wood crackling as it burns and realizes from that sound the quality of the wood, rescues it, and then so the scorching is left as the sign of the near destruction of the material at the very birth of the instrument. And these kinds of instances of scarring and abrasion, and in particular the patina that comes up repeatedly around these objects, I think is also interesting to think about. That these are always, they're sort of signs of these are survivals of something that really is an essential part of the way that they signify for the people who are in the know. So aside from narrative, we also have the other possibility is the claim of the unique relationship. That is, you say that I have a particular fondness for this thing and it becomes part of my collection. And again, this is very interesting. I'm thinking of there are many examples, but one very nice, famous one is Ouyang Xiu. When he gives himself a name, the question of language, naming, personhood, and things. It's very interesting examples, like with Ouyang Xiu's name, Liu Yiju Shi. He's the retired gentleman 6'1". And I don't think that name is remotely understandable by itself. We need to read the story. We read the story in which Ouyang Xiu describes, he just says that, well, I have these few special things that are very dear to me, and they mean something that's personal to me, that's private to me. And So what does liu yi mean? Then it means 6 ones, which means the 5 things plus ouyang xiu. So that the things then become paradoxically both a kind of cover. The number 6 becomes a place where ouyang xiu becomes anonymously distributed among his beloved things. And the things become an integral part of his identity at the same time in the form of this cognomen liu yi ju shi. So this kind of culture of the deflection of a personality into the thing is something I think is very interesting to think about, along with the issues about the things you can be silent about and the things that you can talk about. So I want to keep this very short. Again, most of my concluding comments about commodity fetish, I mean, I think really a lot of the things I was thinking would be interesting to hear more of, you've been working on that section, so it was great. But I do think that this, if we really examine the kinds of role conflict and the places where we ourselves also just kind of smile and don't say anything around commodities and around the role conflicts that become embedded and expressed along with the identity expression, that in fact there's lots of dialogue that's possible here as well. And also finally, I think that maybe one other thing that's interesting to mention in this regard with, Wu Ye's kind of fanciful taking the naming of the play around the object and kind of this is a kind of late, doing the super high level juggling of multiple objects is to think about Wu Ye himself and this, because he himself he began his career as a kind of Wenwu. Right? And he ended as a Wenwu that who was very enigmatic. If you know that, there's the legend about the round stone, that marks his grave. And he simply says, when he says Wu Ye, the poet Wu Ye, that inscription that's the effacement. The stone has no edges, the designation has no official titles, and it's there, the sense it's silent and it's enigmatic in many of these same ways. So I'll leave my comments there and open, because I'm sure people have questions and comments. But so thanks for the paper. A lot of fun.
Oh, I just want to thank Robert for his thoughtful comments. And you probably know that gudong dates from the 16th century. We don't know what it means actually. And when it starts to be used, it's basically at this moment when antiques start being collected and also start being forged. So it's very much a kind of marker of a fissure. So it's a great example. I do plan on historically situating some of these issues a little bit more. And one final thing is I think that, you've given me another great working title for this project, the third molar on the left. My husband's working title for this project is Das Ding an sich anschieden. So very much along the lines of your opening comments. So I would love to hear any other questions that people might have.
If you have questions, raise your hand and I'll bring this over.
Thank you. That was a great talk. I guess I'll start. I don't know if I actually have questions. I just want to comment you sort of in another sort of view. Sort of in your talk about surface and sort of identity of objects and all of these things reminds me of the sort of, I guess, classic sort of a study of sort of surface as a ritualized surface via Zito, via John Hay, sort of idea of the court dress and placing coming in and out and sort of the reading of the surface of a person, obviously. So I don't know if you want to kind of comment on that sort of relationship between that and your work.
I mean, I think it's clearly this. It's a problem in this period, and I think it's kind of articulated in all sorts of different ways. When I think about that vase with the anhua on it, I don't mean that it's literally about the question of archen, but I think that there are these recurrent ways of working out issues having to do with surface that then play out in terms of content in all sorts of different ways. So exactly as you were saying. Okay. Are there any other questions?
I guess I have a sort of vague question. I was really also very interested in how you brought in the Marxist idea of the fetish at the end, and I guess Robert was satisfied with the way you did that. I actually really wanted to hear more though, because you also brought in toward the end this idea of, I think you said, substitute satisfaction, this sort of Freudian idea of sublimation, or even a Freudian idea of a fetish. And I find this really interesting, but I don't know enough about what you're talking about to know how it works out. But is there a way in which the status of the literati at this point, or their sort of uncertain position in society, or their sense of vulnerability, works itself out through these narratives about objects that manifest both as a sort of their a material economy that they're dealing with, as well as an economy of desire? And I guess it's just the old question of how do you combine Marx and Freud, but how do these articulate together?
I mean, I think that, it's through thinking about commodity fetishism that, that this concept of false consciousness arises. This idea that everyone who participates outside of their own immediate self-interest is kind of blinded by false consciousness. And I think that there are all sorts of ways in which this is an incredibly useful concept for thinking about, people in late imperial times, just as it is like, asking those people in Oakland who are being arrested now what they're doing. I'm not saying that it's kind of exclusive to them, but I think these are kind of useful ways of prodding at them a little bit. And if you were to be able to time travel and to bring back someone, or to go down with them and to talk to them, aren't these the sort of things you'd want to know about? Does anyone Does anyone else have any other questions?
This is actually a kind of unformulated question that I'm still working out in my head. And I missed the first few minutes of your talk, and I apologize for that. So maybe you answered it. But first I want to say it was an amazing talk. It was very, very rich. And one thing that I was listening for other reasons perhaps that I felt was hinted at, but I didn't quite hear in the paper, were the questions of discernment. When you talk about the valuation of an object, and also the sense of proprietorship and the right to own something, the feeling of belonging, as well as the displacement of the subject into the object, does the issue of discerning or not discerning value, that is seeing the surface, and is that a way of defining the relationships among the individuals through the recognitions of these objects? I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I think that's absolutely the case, that I think these, so many chuanqi turn into essentially kind of connoisseurship tests, or kind of tests of aesthetics, which are then meant to be character tests, which I think we very easily read into status tests. It's very easy for us to turn this all into a kind of, Bourdieuian, can you top this? So absolutely, and I think in the kind of, Robert is very right that this is a paper that is, has been being written at the moment, and there's a longer version where I talk a lot about discernment and chuanqi specifically, so.
Hold it. Okay. Hi, thank you for your talk. I have sort of a medium-sized question, I guess, but it obviously some of the objects that you discuss are musical instruments, and you seem to be drawing a parallel between visual surfaces and the oral. And so I was just interested in how that parallel works out once we're actually talking about sort of material objects that themselves have surfaces in the visual sense, the scorched material out of which the pipa is made, and this kind of oral surface that you seem to be alluding to in terms of the music itself that's overheard. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
That's not a medium question. That's a big question. I mean, it's clearly, a lot of people have seen these two plays along with Changshen Dian as a kind of trio that are all dealing with dynastic transition, with the place of musicians in an older court having to make their peace with this new power. And in all of them, this idea of music's ineffability, the way that music becomes detached, there are scenes in all of them of music that whose presence cannot be accounted for. And I think, in our age, music is almost never rooted to a human being. We're iPod nation. We're this world of recorded, disembodied music all the time. And to kind of get back to their world, one of the things is, I was just talking to Sophie about being a Suzuki mom. Music is deeply embodied all the time in a pre-modern world. And these moments where nobody knows where music is coming from are deeply eerie and magical. So absolutely, the way in which this kind of material pipa, and you could read all these fetishizings of the wood as being a way to kind of, let's forget about the musicians for now. It is again a kind of wrestling with labor versus objects. But it's there, and it's definitely something that I think I plan on working more on. And one of the ways that this paper started was seeing posters of a Stradivarius cello in the Smithsonian, and thinking that was like a kind of gruesome thing, like having a human being in a zoo or something. This cello that sits in a cage and is never brought out to be played. They do play it? But the fact that you buy these posters of it just seems really kind of grotesque. And so, I think that is a kind of swing back and forth in another way in this period in working out of a lot of the issues that Robert mentioned.
Thank you so much, Tina, for a fascinating talk. I just was thinking, as Robert was speaking, I was thinking about this text that I came across recently, the Mao Shi Ping Wu, which is like a Kaozheng attempt to, sort of late 18th century Kaozheng attempt to discern what the flora and fauna of the Mao Shi would look like. So you have your commentary, and then you have these sort of naturalist type drawings of each of the, plants and insects and so on that you might find. And so thinking of that, I was thinking, one of the things that seems to be at stake in your discussion of sort of solids and surfaces, identity, is conceptions of reference, right? And I'm just wondering, what kinds of conceptions of referentiality are at play here? And one thing that I think, trying to put a couple of things together, but one thing I think that could be linked to perhaps is the kind of approach that we take when we engage in interdisciplinary work, right? And that's something I'm thinking about right now, just how do I avoid reading the same gestures into different kinds of materials? So that's one sort of question. The other kind of question I had was, you mentioned the sort of Ding an sich, right? And I was thinking, when you said that about the way in which Heidegger's notion of, sort of the jugging, this kind of Bavarian kitsch, underlies so much of sort of watered down thing theory that we've been reading, right? And one of the questions I have is, are conceptions of the object similar in the 17th century? Are we talking about the same kinds of subject-object distinctions? And if not, then how does that influence the way we think about the thing, right? Because I think that this idea of the thing that has a depth that exceeds, our capacity for discernment, or is very much, related to the way in which Heidegger has entered thing theory.
I'm actually can't read that Bill Brown essay without feeling this deep rage boiling up inside me. And I actually feel like, I think of this kind of thinking about the thing as a kind of intervention in a lot of ways, because, you read Bill Brown, who has written about thing theory, and you feel like, when was this written? Because it is absolutely this kind of presumption of universality where we kind of need to intervene and say, hello. No, I feel like the third molars are different. There are the places where it catches and people are like, kind of marvel at this fissure are different. And I think they are, people write about severed body parts in a very uniquely Chinese way. Poop. It's like this kind of, it is this way in which these, there's something very bodily in a lot of this stuff. And I think it is kind of distinct and kind of, I think of a lot of the project that I'm working on now as basically a riposte to people like Bill Brown and that version of thing theory.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoy. I'm studying collecting culture in 18th century. So one subject I'm studying is seal, carved seal. So it's kind of related to
what kind of silk?
Seal, 印章.
Oh, okay. Oh, seals. Okay.
Seal. Sorry. So one thing I found in 18th century is elites and the merchants, they start to carve inscriptions on the surface of the seal, which was very popular in the 18th century. It started in the 16th century. So because your talk is about surface and solid. But then after they carve the inscriptions on the seals, then they make rubbings. So the rubbings, because of your talk, now I think about rubbing as the surface of the stone. So one question I'm thinking by myself now, sorry, my question is not formulated, is this connections between this object, the ink, and the rubbing as the surface. So I just want to know, because I understand that as people use the rubbing to circulate the rubbing, then they build up social network in the 18th century. But I feel there's some connections between the object and the rubbing, because rubbing also represents words. So it's the connection between the wu and the wen, but also the surface and the stone itself. So I just want to know, how do you think about this? Sorry, my question's not very clear.
Can I give you an equally unclear and vague answer? I think you're right that there's something about the kind of solidity of the ing and the pure image of the rubbing that mean that they're a match, in the same way that I feel like Halomang is about this, the kind of like Bao Yu is earth in this kind of utterly solid way, and the novel is about, in some sense, like these objects, but is then also, I have not yet written about, but want to write about all the trompe l'oeil images in the novel and how they're kind of central. And I don't feel like they've been written about with enough kind of sophistication. So, I think that this is a third molar. It's something that people are kind of, that sticks in their mouths. So an equally vague answer too.
Just one question. What are the candidates for your new translation of Aiwan?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is definitely something I should set my classical Chinese class to next semester. I remember kind of like tittering in classical Chinese classes with Steve back in the day with frolicking and I think fondling and nursing. That's like that, we will have fun with this in the future. Well, thank you all very, very much.